Also at the NATO summit today, Justin Trudeau laid out a timeline to hit a target that has dogged Canada at this week's meeting and for years leading up to it. He said that by 2032, Canada's military spending will hit the 2% of GDP required of all NATO members.
Canada fully expects to reach NATO's 2% of GDP spending target by 2032. We have built in a regular cycle of review in Canada's defence, including a new defence policy update in 2028. Through that process, we will continue to explore opportunities that will further increase defence spending and advance Canada's strategic interests.
The CBC's JP Tasker was watching the Prime Minister's news conference at the NATO summit from Ottawa, and he joins us now live. So, JP, how does the Prime Minister say that Canada is going to get to this 2% target in the next 8 years when we didn't see that happening just a couple of months ago?
The government got the headline it wanted out of this NATO summit with this plan to eventually get to 2% of GDP spending on military and defense issues by 2032, but there are no real details to how they're actually going to put this in place. So we have a timeline, they're going to meet it by 2032, no details as to how they'll actually achieve a massive undertaking, a massive amount of spending that will come as a result of this new commitment. The Parliamentary Budget Officer projects it will take at least $18 billion more a year in spending to reach that 2% target. We're already running deficits of about $40 billion a year, and the government has said it will keep the debt to GDP ratio on a downward slope. So it's unclear how they will actually implement this in the coming years and how they'll actually meet that target without blowing past some of the fiscal railguards they themselves have put in place. We know that we're a long way off from 2%, Jacqueline. We're essentially at 1.37% right now. The only plan we have, the only concrete plan we have, is to get to 1.76% by 2030. So there's a lot of details to be answered. The only thing they really would commit to today is buying some submarines down the line, 12 submarines at some point, from who we're not quite sure at this point, and when they'll be delivered is still an open question. It could take more than a decade to actually get those submarines delivered, but that is one concrete commitment that has been made. We also know they're floating the idea of buying some new long-range missiles. They want to replace some of our tanks, maybe the light armored vehicles. So some possibilities of things that might happen down the line to potentially meet this 2% target by 2032. A lot of open questions that still need to be answered, but they got that headline, as I said, 2% target. They plan to meet it by 2032. That's what they're promising leaving Washington today.
Perhaps, JP, that is a bit of the reason why this is being announced at this point in time. But it was interesting because one of the reporter questions during that press conference was, why not have done this earlier so all of this pressure hadn't been put on Canada in the recent weeks leading up to this summit?
Yeah, I want to play some tape for our audience just to give you a sense of why the Prime Minister is not all that keen on this 2% target. He was pretty frank, frankly, with reporters today, saying that he doesn't really think this is a great marker to meet, that he's not really sold on the value of actually spending 2% of GDP on the 2% of the economy every year on national defense. He thinks it's a bit arbitrary. Have a listen to what he said earlier.
We continually step up and punch above our weight, something that isn't always reflected in the crass mathematical calculation that certain people turn to very quickly, which is why we've always questioned the 2% as the be-all and end-all of evaluating contributions to NATO.
So crass, that's how he describes that 2% target. I should say it's not just the press or other people that are, bandying about this 2% target. Canada has repeatedly committed to spend 2% of its GDP at NATO summits. Justin Trudeau's government has signed on the dotted line when required to commit to spending 2% of GDP. It's not really an arbitrary figure. It's something that the government has long had as policy to achieve. Now we have this target. Why is it happening now, Jacqueline? Well, we've heard a lot of criticism from some of Canada's allies, particularly the Americans this week, as the Prime Minister has been there in Washington. We heard in particular from Speaker Mike Johnson, who of course is the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, an ally of Donald Trump. He was saying this week that Canada's spending on defense and military matters is shameful. He accused Canada of riding America's coattails. We heard something similar from Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the U.S. Senate, saying that it's time for Canada to step up and start spending some more money on hard power. They're getting tired, essentially, of us not meeting our obligations. So that's probably why they came up with this plan to announce a 2% timeline on the last day of the summit to try and tamp down on some of the criticism that has been thrown about all week in Washington. Jacqueline?
Okay, JP, thanks so much. That's the CBC's JP Tasker in Ottawa.